Quite a long passage that. Don't worry, I've got 2 points. The first one is quite long, so bear with me, and the second one is quite much shorter. I do want to mention as well that this talk was adapted from somebody else's material, so I'm not taking credit for all of it. Can I just recap on what we did last week? I wasn't actually in the service, I was in Sunday Club, but I believe last week we went up to verse 15 rather than 16, so Martin missed off verse 16. But I'm just going to recap that. Last week we heard that in total we heard that Jesus sent out his disciples on a short-term mission. He gives them instructions on that mission, but his message here seems to drift more into the long-term mission, which makes this passage slightly more tricky. How do we apply this? Who is the audience? When will this happen? Well, I think it's helpful to say about chapter 10 that it was happening, it has happened, and it will happen. It's what's known as a telescoping prophecy, which means that it's an interpretive understanding of how the fulfillment of prophecy works. It postulates that throughout time, from the moment the prophecy is given to the time it's fulfilled, it's like a telescope that starts small on the left-hand side and gets larger towards the right. So the persecution was happening to them. The persecution will happen to them more, and the persecution will continue to happen to his disciples. In this section, Jesus envisaged a long period of time when his disciples would be persecuted and yet witness to the truth. He starts off by speaking about his mission that the disciples are about to go on, and then he pans out to include all believers and even including the Great Tribulation. Excuse me. Jesus forecasts the global Holocaust that is coming on his church and his disciples. So I'm going to break this whole passage down into 2 sections, and I've just realised I haven't picked the clicker up, so that's not good, is it? Clicker on. The title is Jesus Divides. Sorry, I should have started with that. The first section is persecution, and that can be found in chapter 10, verses 17 to 36. And in this section, we've got 2 points. Expect persecution, and the second point is don't live in fear. So under expect persecution, we can see in verses 17 to 25 and 34 and 36. And the main point was introduced last week in the talk in verse 16, or wasn't covered in verse 16, which verse 16 says we are like sheep among wolves. And this follows on into verses 17 to 25. So it was a promise of difficulty and tribulation and persecution. It's like when Winston Churchill said after a heavy setback for the Allies, all I can offer you is blood, sweat and tears. Jesus is promising that life as a disciple of his will be a hard time. Between the first and second comings, things will be bad. This is also a promise of persecution that was actually made many years before. The prophet Daniel predicted successive governments that would get worse and worse until the Christ comes back. Jesus referred to this time as the time of the Gentiles. In the book of Daniel, if you remember from a few months back when we looked at the first part of that book, you'll remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego that illustrates this tension between the state and God's people. These 3 guys were commanded to bow down and worship a statue, which represented the state, but they wouldn't bend the knee, and they're persecuted for it. They're thrown into a fiery furnace. It's an illustration of what life will be like for God-fearing people until Jesus comes back. He is coming back, but in the meantime, things will not go well for the followers of Jesus. So, how do we live in a hostile world? From verse 16, it says, as shrewd as snakes. Now, snakes or serpents in the King James Version carry the idea of clever, prudent, sensible. Don't be naive, but don't be inflammatory. Avoid conflicts and attacks, but have a sense of appropriateness. Don't be an idiot. But verse 16 also says, as innocent as doves. Innocent literally means unmixed. Be different from the world. Be holy. Be prudent and innocent. The bottom line is, we want to win people. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 19 says, for though I be free from all men, yet I have made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. So that's how we live in a hostile world. But the persecution will come from 4 areas. Firstly, it will come from religion. Verse 17 says, they will flog you in their synagogues. Jesus experienced persecution from the religious people of the day, who ultimately put him to death. The early church was almost entirely persecuted by Jews for the first few decades. And we know that in the end times there will be a global religious system. Revelation 17 tells us Babylon the Great will be a worldwide religious system. But what about today? Radical Islam is increasingly a threat to Christians all over the world. But not only Christians, but anyone who won't submit to Muhammad and the Quran. Remember in 2013 in London, a British soldier was beheaded in the middle of the day. The two men who did it were Muslim and were quoting the Quran. They were Muslim street preachers. Don't doubt radical Muslims who believe the Quran desire to bring us under submission to Muhammad or else behead us. Newsweek magazine from February 2012 had on its cover, "The War on Christians." The title of the article was "The Rise of Christophobia. From one end of the Muslim world to the other, Christians are being murdered for their faith." The world is a dangerous place. Secondly, persecution will come from government. You will be brought before governors and kings, verse 18 says. In the past 2,000 years, much of the persecution that has come against Christians has come through the state. The state has been responsible for millions of deaths. Think about communism and extreme left-wing socialism. They hate Christianity. Dr. John MacArthur said, "Government is ordained by God, but manipulated by Satan." But this persecution was promised by God. We will be persecuted. The world will hate Christians because the world hates Christ. John 15, verses 18 and 19 say, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." But what about today? How can we expect the state to persecute us? Well, firstly, Paul tells us to pray for freedom and peace. But if the Lord chooses to judge our nation, which we can see happening, then I think we can expect things to get worse. Possibly persecution through the courts, maybe jail for preaching the word. We've already seen that, haven't we? Street preachers arrested for disturbing the peace here in the UK. But the Holy Spirit will direct us as we go. And as for us as Brits, we still enjoy a great measure of freedom. But are we prepared to not bend the knee to the state if the state ever asks us to go against the word of God? I hope it doesn't, but that day may come. I think we came close to it in the last 2 years, when the government's knee-jerk reaction to COVID was to close down the churches, despite there being no evidence that it would make any difference to the spread of COVID. And if history repeats itself, that day will come. The third persecution will come from family. Brother will betray brother unto death. This may be the most difficult form of persecution. To be ostracized from your family because of Christ is no easy thing. Conflict will come on account of Jesus. Jesus will ultimately bring peace, but not right away. Verse 34 has to be one of the most striking statements that Jesus has ever said. Isn't it a contradiction to what the angels said at the birth of Jesus? Glory to God in the highest, and on the earth peace among those with whom he is pleased. Jesus is even called the Prince of Peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. God is a peacemaker. His gospel is called the gospel of peace, a gospel of reconciliation. It makes reconciliation not only between sinners and God, but between sinners and sinners. So what is meant by the statement in verse 34? Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. F.F. Bruce, the well-known Scottish biblical scholar, says it means the sword is the effect of his coming, not the purpose of his coming. Just like many people thought the return of the Messiah would bring them peace and prosperity right there and then, many people today think the Messiah is supposed to bring peace and prosperity right now. Jesus says, in effect, I have not come to bring you your best life now, but I have come to bring you your worst life now. Your life might be miserable because of your attachment to me. People hate me, and they may hate you too. So even though Jesus is the Prince of Peace, people treated him with hostility and murder. He didn't experience peace, he experienced death. The same will happen to his followers. So beyond the family generally, there will be hostility in the marriage. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 14 says, "For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." It will be a metaphorical sword in some marriages because of Jesus. There will be conflict and aggression for some marriages because of the gospel. Jesus tells us that we should not expect peace and tranquility. The fourth area of conflict will be society. "All men will hate you because of me," verse 22. Hated by all people generally, society as a whole. The Bible makes it clear that true Christians will not be cool in the world's eyes. This is a tough pill to swallow, but the sooner we do, the better. I think film, TV, and the media in general will not portray Christians in a positive light. We will be seen as haters, as bigots, as intellectually inferior. Universities and schools will continue to disparage Christians. The hatred and hostility will come from all society, and it will go from bad to worse. But let's not play the victim. Let's not cry foul and pout our way to the promised land. Let's proudly bear the name of Christ. Let's thank God that we are considered worthy of suffering for his name. And honestly, our suffering is nothing compared to the suffering going on in the rest of the world, is it? Is the UK heading south down a moral sewage pipe? Yep. But should that worry us? It was never meant to be a utopia, and we're not home yet. I mostly like living in the UK, but I love heaven more. I'd like to quote my son from an instant message on WhatsApp a few weeks ago. We were discussing various aspects of what's been going on in Ukraine and the nuclear brinksmanship, and he closed the exchange of comments about the conflict with, "Come quickly, Lord." I think they're words we should echo. But we should also remember, he who stands firm to the end will be saved, verse 22. Hebrews 2 verse 1 reminds us, "We must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away." And verse 23 from our passage, "When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another before the Son of Man comes." Don't take it like a man if you don't have to. Run away. You're not obliged to get arrested or imprisoned if you don't have to. Paul did this. When persecution became too intense, he left for another region. We have plenty of work to do and many people to reach. Our work won't be finished until Christ returns. And finally, in this section, we should expect persecution because Jesus was persecuted, verses 24 and 25. Beelzebub means head of the house. It was a common name for Satan or Prince Baal. Jesus was called Satan. He was criticized for casting out demons by the prince of demons. So we shouldn't expect anything less. So that's the persecution we should expect. But in consideration of that, don't live in fear. Chapter 10, verses 26 to 33. Such statements about persecution might have freaked the disciples out. Statements about being dragged in front of governors and kings and having family members hate you might cause some people to fear. Starting in verse 26, Jesus tells them they need not fear. He calls his disciples to be fearless, but not foolish. Disciples shouldn't seek out persecution, but there may be circumstances when they need to pick up and move town. Maybe they thought they needed to stockpile weapons. Believe it or not, Jesus seems to imply that both of these may be legitimate options. Last week we heard Jesus telling them to move towns because of persecution might be the right thing to do. In Matthew 10 verse 14, "If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that home or town." And Jesus also tells the disciples in Luke's Gospel to be prepared to defend themselves. Luke 22 verse 36b, "And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." But they should not move out of fear. They should not purchase a sword out of fear. And Jesus gives these reasons why they need not fear and why we need not fear. Don't fear because the truth will prevail, verses 26 to 27. The disciples will be vindicated. Teach publicly what you learn privately, and the truth will prevail, and every knee will bow. The gospel, which was suppressed and ignored, covered or hidden by some, will be revealed and exposed. The light will expose the darkness. So rest in the truth. And don't live in fear, because God is more powerful than man. Verse 28. Physical death is nothing compared to spiritual death. They can take your body, but they can't take your soul. When I was preparing this, it reminded me of that classic Mel Gibson film when William Wallace shouts, "They may take our lives," I'm not going to do it in Scottish, don't worry. "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." They can take our body, but they can't take our soul, can they? Our eternal destiny is secure, so have no fear. If you remember back to our series on Proverbs, Proverbs 9, verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." So, fear God, not man. Fear God, not governments. Fear God, not legislation that persecutes. Fear God, not family members that hate you. Fear God, not society. Fear God, that's wisdom. And finally, don't fear because God is sovereign, verses 29 to 32. This verse is amazing. Verse 29, "Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father." The dust in the air, the flight of the sparrow, the cry of a baby, the division of cells, the rotation of the sun, even the growth of cancer cells, the election of a government, the loss of a job, the path of a tornado, the flight of the asteroid, none of those things can take place without the knowledge and decision of the Lord. I mean, how amazing is that? Verse 31, "You are worth more than many sparrows." God cares about the birds. That thought alone should encourage us. You are more valuable than the birds. This ought to give us an enormous amount of confidence, even when we are like sheep amid a pack of wolves. I just want to mention an example about Martin Luther. Luther was no stranger to controversy. He lived much of his life on the run, being smuggled by friends from here to there, living in hiding but not living in fear, translating the Bible into German while he was on the run. These reformers were like sheep in the midst of a pack of wolves. Many of them were burned at the stake for such crimes as translating the Bible into English. Such crimes. And other horrifying crimes. They clung to the providence of God, though. Luther rested in the promises of verse 29 to 31 by saying, "God not only created human beings, but also let his dear Son suffer for them. Therefore he will and must care for them far more than he does for the worthless sparrows." So there is no reason to fear. God cares for you more than the sparrows. Now, that was the first bit. The second bit, first bit was persecution. The second bit is priorities. And that can be found in verses 37 to 42. Jesus highlights two major points. There will be family priorities and there will be eternal rewards. Family priorities, verses 37 to 39. "Anyone who loves his father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." So, ultimate loyalty belongs to Jesus alone. Jesus demands this when he summarizes the law. In Matthew 22 to 34 to 40, we can see that. The number one priority is to love God above everything else. Our first priority is to God. Jesus is to come first. I want to give another example of Charles Spurgeon's wife and how she was sad about his distraction. Charles Spurgeon, before he got married, had picked up his fiancée to take her to a place where he was going to preach. And when they arrived, they were separated by a massive crowd of people. Spurgeon was a bit of a celebrity, even as a 20-year-old, and thousands of people were pushing in to hear him preach. And so he sort of pushed his way up to the platform, and after the meeting was over, he couldn't find his fiancée anywhere. So he just went over to her house, and he found her there, and she was sort of pouting and crying. And she said, "Charles, you left me in that crowd all alone, and you weren't even concerned where I was." And this is what he said. "I'm sorry, but perhaps this was what happened was providential. I didn't intend to be impolite, but whenever I see a crowd like that waiting for me to preach, I'm overwhelmed by a sense of responsibility. I forgot about you. Now let's get one thing straight. It will have to be the rule of our marriage that the command of my master comes first, and you shall have the second place. Are you willing, as my wife, to take the second place while I give the first place to Christ? He loved his wife. He loved her to the death, but he never made a god out of her. His God was the true God. Jesus is to come first. Jesus demands this in his church as well. Revelations 2:2-6 tells us lovelessness is a serious matter to Jesus, and the church in Ephesus had abandoned love and loyalty and devotion to Jesus. Jesus is worth our utmost loyalty and devotion. But what does this look like in practice? How do we give our ultimate priority to Jesus while at the same time loving our families? Now, I've set this up as one of the questions to think about, so if you want to discuss that a bit more, come to Life Group on Tuesday. We're having food as well, so that'll be good. Do join us for a deeper discussion on today's passage, that question amongst other things. But I'm just going to give you some quick headings on that. Families are to prioritize the Lord Jesus Christ, prioritize family worship, prioritize the church gathered, and families are to prioritize private worship. But what this passage does not mean, I think it's important to say, is that Jesus is not telling us not to love our kids a lot. He's not telling us that we don't really love our family. It's not a call to neglect or downplay your love to your family. On the contrary, the reality is that you actually love your family the most when you love Jesus more. The best thing you could do for those around you is to impress them with Jesus. The best and nicest thing you could do for your kids is to point them to Jesus and to demonstrate joyful, meaning Christianity. So this passage does not mean we are to neglect our families. So ultimate love and loyalty belongs to Jesus alone, above family and above self. Verse 38 says, take up your cross. We will live for Christ or we will live for ourselves. This statement of take up your cross is not a common metaphor today. We don't hear that talked about a lot, do we? Other than the Lord's cross, we don't think much about crosses. But Jesus' audience did. So this saying of taking up your cross would have implied a complete renunciation of oneself. It was a death to the self-life and the beginning of a completely new life. Jesus demands this of all his followers. Follow me meant follow the teacher. But following Jesus isn't like changing your political persuasion or picking up a new hobby. It's a call to deny yourself and your priorities and adopt the priorities of your master. It's a complete life change. And if you don't understand that, you need to examine yourself with the words of Jesus here. There should be a willingness to forsake everyone, even one's own life, for Jesus. C.T. Studd, the well-known British missionary to China, said to his 3 daughters on his deathbed, I wish I had something to give you, but I gave it all to Jesus a long time ago. Part of following Christ is saying goodbye to your old life. If a person is unwilling to lay down his rights, his opinions, then he or she cannot follow Jesus. If a person says, for instance, I want to follow Jesus, but I'm unwilling to stop living my lifestyle, I'm unwilling to stop, for example, sleeping with my girlfriend, or I'm unwilling to give up any other immorality, then that person can't really be a disciple of Jesus. The second point in this section of priorities is eternal rewards. This world may be hard for you as a Christian, but you will be rewarded. Verse 40-42. Most Christians today think very little about eternal rewards. How you prioritize serving him in this life determines how you will serve him in eternity. I've got a long text up here now, but just bear with me. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 10-15. I'll have to put it over 2 slides. Sorry, there. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building it. But each one should be careful how he builds. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation, Using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. He will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If it is burned up, he will suffer loss, and he himself will be saved, but only as one escaping the flames. The blessings of the future kingdom will offset the sacrifices made here in this life. The loss of losing parents and children due to the gospel is painful. The persecution experienced is painful. The hostility because of being attached to Jesus is painful. But all of that pain will eventually be offset in the coming kingdom. But you will be rewarded for your work as a disciple of Jesus. 42b says, I tell you the truth, he will certainly not lose his reward. And even the smallest gestures towards the Lord's people will be accounted for. A cup of cold water in verse 42 was a gift even the poorest person could give. Even menial tasks will be taken into account. Anyone can do this. None of us have seen Jesus in the flesh. None of us have met him personally in that sense. But we have met his disciples. In fact, most of us have come to Christ because someone told us about him in the gospel. Jesus is saying in 3 roughly equivalent ways that those who receive his followers, because they accept what those individuals stand for, will in turn be received by God. In Mark 10:28 and 29, Peter said to Jesus, we have left everything to follow you. And Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children and fields, and with them persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Following Jesus involves leaving things behind and giving things up. For some people, maybe, for example, a practicing gay person or an unmarried person living with their partner, it will involve a whole lifestyle change, leaving behind a whole lifestyle. But however much we leave behind, we are never out of pocket. Whatever is given up, Jesus replaces in godly kind and greater measure. No one who leaves will fail to receive, and the returns are extraordinary, 100-fold. For what we give up for Jesus does not compare with what he gives back. Even if the costs are great, the rewards are even greater, even in this life. There's a lot more to say on this issue, but the main point is this. So you'll be glad to know I'm not going to go on and on. The moment you think following Jesus is a poor deal for someone, you call Jesus a liar. Discipleship is not always easy. Leaving anything behind is profoundly hard. But Jesus is always worth it. So in conclusion about this passage, expect persecution, but don't live in fear. Have priorities. And remember, Jesus is always worth it. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, thank you for the many things we can learn from the commission Christ gave his disciples when he sent them to preach the good news to the kingdom of Israel and empowered them with strength from on high. Thank you that in Christ we have all we need for life and godliness through the power of the indwelling Spirit of Christ. We praise you that in this world of sin and deception there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, and nothing that is hidden that will not be known and judged appropriately by you. Thank you for your love towards all your people of faith, and help us to live and work for your praise and glory. In Jesus' name, amen.